Morena, no mai haramai. Welcome to our Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee meeting today, Thursday, the 9th of June 2022. Here we go. Thank you very much. So also we have, obviously we're streaming live, so to those who are watching from afar, welcome to our meeting this morning. Anybody coming in on Zoom? No, thank you very much. Just our mobiles, we know what to do with those. I hope we can take a break, a morning break around about 11 o'clock and conclude somewhere about 12:30 if at all possible. We have the press with us this morning. Good morning, welcome, and of course to you, Jeff, and our hard-working team here at Council, no mai haramai. So we will go to now, thank you very much, we have a karakia this morning from Councillor Yates.
Nō reira kia hihiri tātou, tūtawa mai I runga, tūtawa mai I raro, tūtawa mai I roto, tūtawa mai I waho. Kia tau ai te Mori tū, te Mori ora, ki te katoa, haumi e, hui e, tae ki e, and as we are reo rua, I summon from above, I summon from below, I summon from within, I summon from the surrounding environment, the universal vitality and energy to infuse and enrich all present, enriched, unified and blessed. Tēnā tātou.
Thank you, Councillor Yates. We have one apology today from Councillor Kai Fong. Thank you. And mover, thank you, Councillor Wang.
Sorry, another apology from Mrs. Trumper.
Oh, thank you. Mrs. Trumper as well, thank you. Are you moving those too? Thank you, Councillor Wang. Thank you, Councillor Donaldson. It has been moved and seconded that we accept the apologies. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, thank you, carried. Any declarations of interest this morning? Carl, thank you. Urgent items not on the agenda? Carl, thank you. A confirmation of the minutes of the Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee meeting held on the 12th of May 2022. May I have a mover and a seconder, please? Thank you that the minutes be confirmed as a true and correct record. So we have a mover and a seconder. Mr. Thomas and Councillor Yates. It's been moved and seconded. Are there any corrections to the minutes to be? Yes.
Madam Chair, I just realised I was absent last meeting, so perhaps I'm not a good person to move the minutes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Then Councillor Yates. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Any corrections? No, thank you. I'll put that motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, thank you. It was Councillor Donaldson, yes, thank you. So we move to page 13 of our agenda, staff reports, and our first item, 6, consideration of feedback to the Rotorua Lakes Council long-term plan year 2 delivery 2022/23. It's a discussion document. Could I have a mover and a seconder to receive the report, please? Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Thank you, Mr. Donaldson. We have a mover and a seconder to receive the report. I'll put that motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? Thank you. Carried. Morena, Thomas.
Morena, Madam Chair, councillors and board members. Just quickly bring up the presentation. And should take about 10 minutes to work through this presentation, and then happy to take any questions at the end.
Thank you.
So just a reminder again that we are focusing on year 2 of our long-term plan, and we are just in the process of completing year 1 of that plan and focusing on year 2. Underpinning the plan is obviously Vision 2030 and the underlying vision to action, and in particular the key LTP strategies that make up the LTP. Of those are really these 5 key strategies, so homes and thriving communities, community safety, economic development, climate change, and our key network infrastructure. So the LTP was constructed in the current COVID environment and the turmoil that we are experiencing in our world at the moment, and was predominantly in response to some of the challenges that were coming out of that, in particular focusing on housing for our community, freeing up more land, focusing on the inner city and our community safety as a response to some of the social challenges that we're seeing in our community, economic development around creating jobs for our community, climate change, and in particular a large focus on making sure that our infrastructure is fit for purpose and being looked after. We went out for consultation for year 2. We went out for a 4-week period. We received a small response written. 10 people did, or groups did submit to that. We did hold 2 community meetings, and we did unfortunately have low turnout to those meetings as well. And of the feedback, it is fairly mixed. And unfortunately, a majority of the feedback is off topic as well with regards to the questions that we were asking. Staff have reviewed and considered the feedback, and our recommendation at this stage is to have no amendment to the proposal that went out. So just a summary of what went out, a proposed rates increase of 5.7% in line with what year 2 of the LTP was. It is what's being proposed, probably significantly lower than what some of our peers in the region and other councils are proposing. They are closer to 8s, 9s and 10s. A debt increase of $84 million, and that's again broadly in line with what the year 2 of the LTP was expecting, and that really is to support a $143 million infrastructure and community asset program. Continuation of a focus on housing and development, and also we anticipate seeing some key cultural assets back online, and particularly the Performing Arts Centre. My apology, I've used the old acronym there. But we are planning and obviously working in a world where there are significant risks and challenges. So we still are looking at local government reform, there's still RMA reform, there's still Three Waters reform, and there's civil defence reform. And all these streams of work are moving at different paces, and the government at the moment will choose as to whether to accelerate those or not, and what those impacts may be to us in the future are a little unknown at this stage. COVID-19 is still around us, even though most of us have adjusted to this new world, but it is seeing impacts. In particular for us, it's seeing impacts with regards to tourism, visitors in particular. We're now starting to see people from coming outside of New Zealand back into the community, and so we expect to see an uptake with regards to the economic activity for our people, but that is still there. Inflation tracking at 6.9% across New Zealand, remembering that's the headline CPI inflation, and it is forecast to continue to get higher. Underneath of that, we are seeing inflation pressures across the board, just like everyone else in New Zealand, but we are seeing pressures well in excess of that headline figure. In particular, anything to do with construction is seeing 10, 20, 30% price fluctuations, and anything to do with labour. There is a labour shortage within New Zealand, and it would seem the world, and there is great pressure to try and retain staff and attract new staff as well, and again, not unique to us. There's a risk around the revenue stream, so we are seeing now, as with the opening up, we're seeing events coming back into Rotorua, and in particular into our venues. So, but again, with the uncertainty of what's in front of us, that may change again. And as I mentioned before, staff retention. Now, here's a little something I stole from the Daily Post, but did have to rejig a little bit. So, and this is really just highlighting, when I talk about inflation, sometimes it's hard to imagine what that means. And this, I think, was back late May. I think there was an article around the rising costs of building. And so what you see here is that that industry alone is seeing significant increases across the board, and they are continuing. And when we do our business, and in our business, a lot of the costs that you're seeing there are costs that we are too facing. And at the moment, we try to absorb it, but also sometimes you can't offset it, and so these are the pressures that we face. And in particular, when you start talking about a rates increase of only 5.7% and an adoption of a capital works program in line with year 2 of your LTP, that has a much smaller inflation factor built in. Now, while those numbers have contingencies built in, this organisation will be under immense pressure going forward as we work with the inflationary challenges that are in front of us. Now, we did talk about this at O&M last week, and we did talk about obviously how we are managing that, but you do need to be aware that going forward, that with the tight fiscal envelope that we've set ourselves, it may be challenging to absorb and mitigate all these challenges going forward. I think I've covered that one off. Another topic, just slightly changing topic, is something that we've considered is actually the impacts of emergency housing. And so what we are seeing is an escalation of costs being driven into our organisation as a response to those challenges. And at the moment they are falling off on the general rate. And so what we are looking at, and this is something for the new council to consider at the next annual plan, is actually the investigation of a targeted rate against the emergency housing providers, whereby the costs that are resulting from their activities are actually sheeted home to them. So as they are the exacerbators of that, the targeted rate recovers the cost of those services in response to them. Now, it's not something that we can do now because it is a long-term plan amendment, and it is an amendment to our funding and revenue policies. And what we are doing at the moment is just having discussions with our solicitors around how to structure that targeted rate. And then again, as I said, this will be something for the new council following the elections to consider as to whether they wish to do this and consult on it in the new year. But at this stage, it's not something that we've previously been able to talk about or implement this time because it does require an amendment to our long-term plan.
Can you speak up a bit, please? Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
I'll bring it closer. So, funding our services and rates. So we have talked previously about the 5.7% underpinning that housing water sustainability costs. So there is a significant investment around a couple of our main water supplies and the resource consent conditions. We have funded additional depreciation. What we are seeing as an organisation is that our asset valuations every year are coming in much higher than anticipated, and that's a reflection of the inflationary environment. Therefore, our depreciation expense is a lot higher than we expected, and as a result, our renewal program that is funded from our depreciation is also a lot higher. And so we are therefore having to put more funding into funding depreciation, which therefore funds the underlying renewal program. And there has been significant reinvestment into that in this plan, but what I am signalling is that going forward we are seeing obviously a rapid increase in valuations, which will result in even more depreciation, which will result in more funding required for renewals. The underlying plan is there's been no uplift in our cost base with the exception of contractual inflation, and so that's actually just 3 main contracts, Infracore, our waste management and our wastewater services. The remaining cost base, with the exception of staff, has been held at 0. We have focused on staff retention. We are seeing high turnover just like every other organisation in New Zealand, and we are targeting an uplift there to retain our staff, but also create the ability to attract new, and finance costs. How is those rates made up? So there is a nearly 50-50 split between targeted rates and general rates. We have seen a slight shift on what we'd consulted on, where we were 5.7 across both general rates and targeted rates, but it has just shifted slightly. And as a result, the sample rate payers has also changed slightly, and so what we have done is the rates uplift has not gone on to our uniform annual general charge, so it all falls on targeted rates or the general rate that falls on capital value, and so it's not an even 5.7% rate increase across the board. but it is actually a very tight banding, as you can see there. And there's only really a subtle change on what we did consult on. Our capital works program, $143 million, $44 million of that is asset renewals, so a significant reinvestment into looking after our existing infrastructure, finishing off key projects, Rotorua, the new resource consent and upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant, looking at the Tarawera sewerage scheme, the museum, the Performing Arts Centre, completion of the lakefront, etc. That program will face inflationary and logistical challenges. At the moment, we know roughly what it looks like, but until we actually get to some of those projects, when we start procurement, when we start QSing, we won't actually know what may happen, and we will deal with those when they arise. Sorry. I think I've covered this one off. With regards to our debt, the blue shading is our new debt trajectory. The grey line is the debt profile that was in our long-term plan, and the blue line is our debt limit. So you will see that we are currently taking on less debt than was anticipated in the long-term plan, and that's a reflection of the timing and deferment in some of our key capital works programs, and we will see us getting back to the same point in 2024, 2025 of the LTP. Now, there is a risk that that won't occur, because if our capital works program is impacted by unforeseen challenges, then and those projects may not be able to progress at the pace that we anticipate, then obviously we will not take on as much debt as we anticipate either. So just in summary, proposed rates increase of 5.7%, debt of $84.4 million, broadly in line with our long-term plan, $143 million investment across infrastructure and community assets, significant focus on, in particular, around housing and freeing up land and getting more housing opportunities for our people, and key regional assets coming back online. With that, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas. It actually makes for sobering, sitting here, it makes for very sobering reading, you know, when you put up the risks and how do we manage, and yes, so I'm interested in the questions that come forward. Thank you. Mr. Thomas?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of questions and also a bit of a bouquet, I think, for sticking to originally projected rates increase for this term with all the inflationary pressures that we've seen during this last year. I think actually we've done quite well in spite of some comments from the community. One thing I noticed is that in previous years we've had a lot of discussion coming back in the feedback around sticking to core business and stuff like that. Now we've had our requirements expanded to cover the 4 well-beings. I noticed there hasn't been too much feedback presented to us on that. Are you feeling we're coping with addressing all the well-beings in the annual plan this year round? I know it's a bit of a woolly question, but just wondering how you're feeling about our spread overall, and you know that perennial argument around well-beings and core responsibilities, I guess, of council.
Yep. I'll just remind council that obviously the bringing back of the well-beings into the mix was a number of years ago, and obviously is embedded into our long-term plan and was at the heart of the long-term plan when it was created well over 18 months ago. So as there's been no change in our strategy and direction in our plan, it does reflect and support those 4 well-beings.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one other question too. I noticed in the feedback there was a certain amount of discussion around us freezing rates and cutting back what we're doing. You mentioned some of the key projects that are driving our expenditure this coming year, which sewage at Rotorua being finished off, wastewater treatment plant and stuff like that. It seems, and I'd just like your comment, reasonably obvious that these are things we can't back out of doing. We've actually already started a lot of these major projects, so they need to continue. We can't actually stop them halfway through. I presume that's correct.
That is correct, and just a reminder to councillors and members that projects that are fairly well underway are experiencing, I would say, minor impacts from those inflationary logistical challenges, whereas those projects that are very early on in the stage with regards to about to enter procurement, about to go to market, are experiencing much more significant challenges. So the risk to us is not so much in those that are being finished. There is a risk that unforeseen things will occur, but it should be fairly minor. The risk is more in those larger programs that are about to start.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, Thomas. I take on board your comments about the pressures if we stick to a 5.7% and the inflationary pressures that we're facing. Do your calculations make any assumptions around the introduction of a development contributions policy in September?
Yes, so our long-term plan anticipated the reintroduction of development contributions, and they were programmed in to come into year 2. And as we are discussing year 2, we do anticipate them coming in, obviously subject to a future decision that is in front of you.
Your Worship.
Well done, Thomas. I think what we obviously put out hasn't caused the stir in the community that we anticipated. 10 responses. Are you surprised at that? It's probably Una's response, but in the past, this has been the hot topic of council business, but 10 responses is surprising in this environment, especially when, as you said, we're facing incredible escalation of cost pressures and inflation.
It was surprising to all staff, and I think one of the sessions that I attended in the library where 2 people attended was surprising considering the participation rates I've experienced in the past. Yep.
Well done.
Thank you. It could also be that people are weary. You know, the last couple of years, people have got tired. They're trying to balance their own bank balance, and so they may be just weary of what's going on in the environment around them. And
also, to Madam Chair, I think we have a lot more different channels these days. We are pushing information through digital means, and I think maybe the community is adjusting to those as well.
Thank you. Councillor Tatzel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you. The question that I have is around the key strategy of homes and thriving communities that was part of this consultation. And when I read through all of the submissions, there was one that particularly resonated with me about Council's community safety strategy will not be achieved until the root cause of significant and unacceptable changes are addressed. Now, you've mentioned in your presentation the potential, you've mentioned the impacts of emergency housing on this community, and we have not only felt it in terms of council and additional funding and time we've had to put aside around community safety, but also our partners at the police and community service providers within the community. So I strongly support the investigation of a targeted rate into emergency housing so that it's not just the local ratepayers that are having to foot the bill, because unfortunately it's been a tap that we haven't been able to turn off. And while we do a good job and our staff have done an incredible job at planning for the future around council decisions and council projects, it's very hard for us to plan for that increased cost that is coming from, unfortunately, a poorly managed situation with emergency housing. So I do support investigating and implementing a targeted rate, and around those costs that come from emergency housing.
Yes, the targeted rate is actually not up for, excuse me, Councillor Tapsell, targeted rate is actually not up for discussion today.
Well, it came through the presentation.
Yes, it came through and as you heard Thomas say that will be something for further on down the track. It's certainly not for discussion today. So if you do have a question, thank you.
That's all, thank you.
Point of order. I just want on the record a comment that Councillor Tapsell made that emergency housing is being poorly managed. I take offence with our housing plan and our approach as a council that we all agreed to with the management of people in emergency
That's
housing.
not a point of order.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Your Worship. What I got from what Councillor Tapsell was saying, she was just alerting us to around community safety and the issues that have come through the housing situation, temporary emergency housing. And it is correct that there are certainly significant issues around safety. So, but just because we don't agree with someone's opinion, that is not a point of order. So can I just make councillors aware of that, please? Point of orders are not just because not to be raised because you just don't agree with what somebody is saying. Thank you. Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Thomas, for your delivery on the LTP. Just got one question. Normally, we always have lots of people, and I think on the streets, people always talk about rates and all because of the cost pressures around everything else, whether it be fuel or rising interest costs. But this time around, just to see 10 submissions, I'm just wondering whether, and our rural communities always complain that their fair share of rates for the services they receive. Was there a very strong lobby from any of the 10 submissions from the rural community regarding the rates?
Only the Fed Farmer submission, which traversed some of those same topics. I think as a reminder, councillors, you will recall last year in year one of the LTP, we saw a significant shift in rates from the rural community, and many of them saw quite substantial rates decreases. And the issues and topics that the Fed Farmers raised were fairly consistent with what they've always done.
Sorry.
Dr. Morgan, through you.
Pardon?
Medipika.
Oh, Councillor.
Tēnā koe, Thomas. Good report, thank you. I'm just wondering though, we've got the 2.5 ratio as the ceiling, and I'm just wondering how that ceiling is affected by revaluation of assets and when that happened, because your comment that as the assets are revalued upwards, then the depreciation cost increases upwards, and so it just seems to me that that's an inflation spiral being set up. So can you just explain that for us, please?
Yeah. So just a reminder, councillors, that our debt is not actually tied to our asset base. So to put it into context, we've got well over $1.5 billion worth of assets and currently carry net debt of about $277 million. So the ratio of debt to assets is on the rather low end. The number that you talked about, Dr. Kipper, was actually the ratio of 2.5 to our income. So our debt limit is actually tied to our income level. So therefore, asset revaluations and all those sorts of aspects don't affect that. What does affect that is obviously rates revenue, which is our predominantly source of revenue, along with our fees and charges. So in challenging economic times like we've seen, where we've seen a decline in some of those external revenues, we feel a little bit of a squeeze on that limit. But just as a reminder, we are currently sitting at about, I think, 180%, and remembering that the limit is 250%. So there is a significant amount of room at the moment.
That's great. That's what I thought. I'm still trying to get my head totally around this, but it seems to me that as the assets are revalued, it increases the depreciation costs that we anticipate, which then impacts upon our need to lend. And I'm just wondering, because there's seemingly high inflation coming with those numbers that you showed us, is there a need to provide a bigger buffer between the 2.5 and our actual debt levels? Because I don't think we'll be able to keep increasing rates at a lower level than inflation and retain the buffer that you've got there between the 2.5 and the debt?
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Yep. So just a reminder to all councillors that we do depreciate our assets, obviously, and the depreciation and how we fund that depreciation funds our renewal program. And we fund our renewal program and our depreciation from rates and operating revenue. We do not fund the renewal of our assets through debt. So therefore, as we see an increase in our asset base and as we see an increase in depreciation and the need to therefore spend more on looking after our assets, that doesn't impact our borrowing because we do not use borrowing to look after our existing assets. It only impacts new things going forward and new assets that are created if we decide to borrow for those.
Okay, so that's why you said Treasury policy would take care of inflation.
Not sure I said Treasury policy would take care of inflation.
Well, maybe I've paraphrased it, but I thought that was up on your...
Our Treasury policy manages the repricing risk of our borrowings.
Yep. I'm not reading it very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Maxwell, then Councillor Yates.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Thomas. I'll just make a couple of comments first before the question, if that's okay.
No, you put your question first, please, Councillor.
Question first?
Yes, questions first, thank you. Then we can move to...
All right, on page 19, there's something that really touched there. It's like the cart before the horse. On that page, it's got abide by the Fenton Agreement 1880 that has been founding document of our tangata whenua for over 140 years. And it's the answer there is going to go back to a relevant committee, a business unit. So the question is, will it go to all departments or just the Omorangi unit? Because, I mean, somewhere out of 10 submissions, somebody in this busy times, as you mentioned, Madam Chair, somebody still found the time to address that. Yep. The question is, will it go to all the departments or just one?
I think, councillors and board members, that I think the submission that you are referring to is one that is quite lengthy and seems to traverse a lot of topics. Staff have considered that, and it's up to you as to whether you wish to consider that submission any further and whether you feel that council should make an adjustment to reflect that submission.
Thank you. And you're welcome to make some other comments later when we open it up. Yes, thank you. And Councillor Yates.
My apologies, Madam Chair. Mine was a comment.
Oh,
so
a comment, fine, thank you. Well, thank you. If there's no further question... Oh, I better... Sorry. Thank you. Yes, well, I wonder if... Thank you. So no further comments. I wonder if I can have a mover and a seconder, please, for recommendations 2, 3 and 4, and then we can get into opening up for discussion. Thank you, Councillor Yates. Thank you, Councillor Tapsell. So it's been moved and seconded. Thank you. So I will then now open it up if there are any discussions on what we've heard in the presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Yates.
Nō reira, through you, Madam Chair, me mihi anō kia koe, Thomas. Mine was actually a comment and from the Creative New Zealand and their submission, and in particular where we're tracking with regards to the SIR. It's just a note of acknowledgement that that's an investment that Rotorua will reap the benefits for come this November and next year, early in 2023. So nei rā te mihi kia koutou.
No further discussion? Oh, sorry, Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd just like to toko the comment on Page 15, paragraph 4 in the report, that much of the feedback did not respond to the content in the discussion document, was inaccurate and showed a lack of understanding of the principles on which Year 2 delivery had been set. I totally agree with that. 22 pages of the 35 appear to be written by one submitter, and I was disappointed to see much of that inaccurate comment in that. Totally support the recommendation on the table today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mr Morgan?
Kia ora tātou. Just a comment that follows up on Mr Thomas's question about the well-beings. Within our long-term plan we have the strategic areas, but there actually isn't one there that specifically addresses cultural well-being in the LGA. And given the amount of change that's occurring in that space, Three Waters, Te Mano Te Wai, well, a 22-page submission. I'm not saying that, but all I'm saying is we are entering a space, well, we're going to have 3 Māori councillors as well for 3 Māori wards. With that in mind, should it be considered that council introduce a way of addressing that well-being specifically? My comment relates to something we've got later as well, but I'm not seeing the ability to clearly differentiate between the spread of effort that Mr Thomas talked about across the 4 well-beings when I look at the different papers and things, the LTP and so on. It's quite difficult to differentiate across that. And I know there's overlap, but I think it's something that maybe council should be thinking about, because this is going to become a bigger issue rather than a smaller issue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, council has been concerned about the 4 well-beings for a number of years, Mr Morgan. They were taken off, they were taken out of local government some years ago, and they've now been put back in, and which is around cultural, social, economic and environmental issues. And they are starting to permeate right through our plans, perhaps not sufficiently to the stage where we would want them to be, but we are certainly getting there and working on them. And they're coming through in most of our reports these days, the significant reports that we're getting. I'm not sure, Your Worship, I saw your hand go up if you wanted to comment on...
Well, I think it's nice to hear a Te Tātou member bring that to the table, but when we affirmed what we took out in the consultation document, we affirmed Vision 2030 and extended it to 2050, and it had the 4 well-beings, and cultural well-being was very much an affirmation of the Vision 2050. It's just hard to pick it out of everything. But I see it reflected in the investment decisions, whether it's the cultural and creative sector, the environment and our infrastructure is built entirely around the investment here in this plan is built entirely around the climate change adaptation that we need to consider in terms of stormwater and wastewater. And I think it's just... we've got to find it, and you want to see it more overtly. I believe that's a futures discussion, that you're absolutely right. All of those legal challenges and reforms ahead of us will involve tangata whenua at the centre, whether it's RMA reforms, CDM, health, or Te Mano o Te Wai. So but that is really for a future council. They might say it differently, but we just carry it with us now in terms of our partnership with Te Tātou and our other partners. And my other comment that I wanted to make, in 9 years, I've never seen such a small response from our community. So while we say in hard times and reminding ourselves it was the COVID environment that we put this together, I take that it's not an overwhelming affirmation, because there are problems ahead and there are big challenges, but to only have 10 responses is amazing. And we were very aware when we set the rates and the differential and our whole Treasury package about the impact on our community, because we're very aware of the demographics of our community and a community under some stress at the moment. So I want to congratulate you. I think that shows that we got the balance about right, because a negative increase in rates or pulling back on expenditure never actually carries our people forward. So well done. And I certainly am in support of the resolution.
Thank you. Can I just also add to Mr Morgan's issue that he raised? We've also seen here the presentation from Te Tata o Te Aroa's 2050, which was really excellent and does inform a lot of, and sit alongside of, as a significant document, sitting alongside of Council's planning documents as well. That's a document that we have always, well, certainly since we've got it, taken into consideration, because that's quite striking. Now I want to go to Councillor Kumar. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Thomas. Once again, Thomas, on the Capital Works programme, something that comes out of rural roads is that spend on rural road extensions are woefully inadequate, and there's a lot of, I believe we used to seal 7 kilometres of before, and then probably wanted to go up to 10 kilometres. Are we reaching our targets in that area with the LTP, or are we seeing decreased? And my other concern is with regards to maintenance programs, because having a tiki tour around the last couple of weeks in this bad weather, I see a lot of culverts blocked. I see lots of raised grass in 300 ml water outlets, all covered, a lot of them with sills. I've taken lots of photos as well in the last 2 weeks, and it seems to me that when I speak to the residents, they tell me that they hardly see anybody coming over there. I mean, the size of the grass does suggest, but it's also raining as well, so they probably multiply 3 times. But is as part of their rates and going future to what they pay in there, was that is the maintenance delivery program adequate to what rates they pay?
At the wish of sounding grumpy, can we please just stay on message and on what's been presented and what we're talking about today? That's really quite important.
Through the chair.
We're talking to the motion at present.
Through the chair, Madam Chair, I beg to differ, because part of the capital spending in the future, in the next 10 years, is what we're going to do for the rural areas. And if the maintenance program is not part of...
We're not talking about the maintenance program at present.
But we're talking about the spend.
We're talking about our long-term plan. That's what we're talking about. What was presented by Thomas this morning, not the maintenance program.
Okay, so if we can just go back to spend on the rural still extensions as being woefully inadequate.
So we are delivering against the agreed program that was set out in the long-term plan. I think there are some challenges at the moment with regards to the cost and which roads, but I understand Stavros's roading team is quite active in that space and working with the rural community. I think it's safe to say that it's going to be incredibly difficult to meet some of the rural people's expectations of sealing every road. And just a reminder that every time we do a rural seal extension, we are borrowing to pay for the sealing of those roads.
Thank you. Councillor Yates.
Through you, Madam Chair, and just following on from Dr Kepper's comment about the cultural wellbeing, which is indicated on page 27, kei te mihi ahau ki a koe, Dr Kepper, because we've already got a great example with Te Tatau and their Mori compass around how we're looking at housing moving forward. And I note also that in our previous strategy and Policy and Finance meeting, we had Dr Amanda Yates present, along with Dr Angus McFarlane, in a way in which Council can perhaps be looking at that Modi compass and the way in which we work. So hopefully that will become an intrinsic part, but that hopefully also will be part of the next Council's, as Thomas also alluded to in his presentation, expectation around what that brings for us at the table. So me mihi ki a koe.
Thank you. Councillor Maxwell.
Thank you, Madam. Chairman, I support the recommendations that are up there. Speaking to that, even though it is a low response, I'm taking note of what has been written in there, because some people have just taken the time, and I was pleased to see some comment on seeing that Council's commitment to the opening of Sir Hal Morrison Centre, especially when only last month we had a full presentation for the centre, and good publicity that went out. And the other one, of course, they want the whare o Taonga o Te Arawa to go ahead. Further on, I want to ask Una a question. Aroha mai, Dr. Kepa, the Local Government Commission, I think if I'm right, they said the Maori ward will be of 3 members, not 3 Maori wards. I asked a question. Oh.
Yeah, you've answered that, thank you.
So just for clarification, it is 1 Maori ward with 3 seats within that.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the discussion this morning. There's no doubt we're under pressure. The organisation is under significant financial pressure. We want to complete what currently we've got, our current plans and projects, and we certainly want to be able to keep up with what we want to do into the future as well, but it's not going to be easy, and that's obvious. We have set the rates at 5.7, an increase of 5.7, and I really sit here and look at all what you put up, Thomas, and wonder if we're not shooting ourselves in the foot by that. You did say that all around the other comparable cities are higher than that. All I'm just saying is I'm looking at that and I'm quite alarmed at what we have to do in the future and how we're going to do it and finance all of that. So it's, I would say turbulent waters ahead, and we've got to manage our way through that. So if there's no further discussion, thank you. And we do have a mover and a seconder for 2, 3 and 4. So I will read those now. 2, that the committee receive the summary and key themes reported as identified from feedback received on the information and discussion document. 3, that the committee notes the direction set during the course of considering feedback will determine and guide the development of the final long-term plan, Year 2 delivery 2022/23. 4, that the committee recommends to Council to proceed to finalising a Year 2 delivery document, the annual plan, for consideration and adoption by the Council on the 30th of June 2022. It has been moved by Councillor Yates, seconded by Councillor Tapsell. I'll put that motion now. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? Thank you. Carried. Oh, sorry, there was one against. Thank you, Councillor Kumar. So carried. Thank you very much. 6.2, page 20 of our agenda. The approach to the Three Waters Be Better Off funding application. Could I please have a mover and a second to receive this report? Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Thank you, Councillor Yates. It's been moved and seconded that the report Approach to the Three Waters Be Better Off funding application be received. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? Thank you. Carried. Morena JP, thank you for overviewing the report for us this morning.
Morena, Madam Chair. So I do have a bit of a presentation just to go through reasonably slowly on, because obviously there's a lot of contention around the Three Waters proposal, but then associated with it is obviously an additional funding stream that we can make application for. So Council, as you're well aware, we've been very successful in the past making applications for Crown Infrastructure Partnership funding, provincial growth funding, and now in the IAF, Infrastructure Acceleration Fund. So this is another funding opportunity for us. So I'll just step you through the purpose of this fund and really give you an overview of some objectives that were set for the funding, at the process and at eligibility, and of course then just trying to identify for you some proposed criteria for us to apply over the top. So once we've taken this first step of looking at the government criteria, look at our own criteria. We will be able to go away and do some work on potential projects to bring back to you for that application process. So obviously this is a Three Waters Be Better Off funding package, and this is quite clear about the criteria that the government has set around that and administered it. And for us, there's a time limit on when we can put forward an application in the next couple of months. So 2 tranches, a 500 million No Worse Off fund, and the other part, which is the focus of today, is a 2 billion Better Off fund, which is available to councils by application. So that's the 2 sort of tranches of funding the government has proposed around the Three Waters changes being proposed. So I think one of the biggest issues is the timing around this part. So obviously what we're talking about at this stage is tranche 1, which is the 8.05 million, which is an application process that needs to be in by September, and we have a time frame then of delivery against those projects. What's more substantial is obviously the tranche 2 part, which is 24.15 million, which is not available until July 2024. So really our focus at this stage and exclusively is on that first $8 million fund, because that's what's in front of us at this stage. You can see there that also there's, apart from their criteria, there is up to 7 years to use the fund, which I always find surprising considering they're wanting projects which are ready to go now. But clearly there is a view about sometimes it still takes a while to put in place the procurement or the delivery of some of those projects. And probably most importantly, because of the links with the debate around the transition around Three Waters, is that participation and application for this fund does not preclude us expressing views around the Three Waters proposal. So they haven't tied it to, if you take the money, there is some criteria set around the voice of council in regard to the current process and proposal. So the report obviously details the criteria, and it really is for new projects or the ability to accelerate or upscale existing projects. 5 years or less of duration of the expenditure. It does have some options about whether it's to support Three Water service delivery or other wellbeing projects. So you'll see from the report further on, we've taken a view that we're more interested in those projects which support local placemaking and focus on that local community wellbeing outcomes rather than putting it into Three Waters infrastructure. So they have their prioritisation criteria there, which is, does it produce value for money? Are there strategic plans in place? Is there Māori support or iwi support? Is there any delivery risk? Because otherwise we won't draw down the funding, so they have a risk view. And is there community support for the projects being proposed? So for us, in the next couple of slides, obviously if you think about this process of identifying potential projects, screening them against the eligibility criteria, and then putting forward an application, really the next couple of slides talks about what do we think the key criteria for us are to identify the project or projects we would put forward as an application process. So really for council's perspective, we just thought we'd come back again to just outside of the DIA criteria, just look at some of the ones that we think are important if we're to bring back a short list of potential projects to you or recommendations of projects to apply for. And for us, as officers recommending to you, we believe the selection criteria for council projects that we should put forward are really to focus around these criteria, which are really on a pass-fail basis. So if it fails, it's out as a potential project. So really a view that we should be continuing to focus on finishing what we've started. So a really important criteria there. In line with the DIA projects, but equally for ourselves, do we actually know what we're intending to do? So is it construction ready, either to procurement or we have the plans, and have we been through that sort of engagement process to actually shape those projects? Another criteria there, which is prioritise baseline outcomes. So as you're aware, whenever we put forward a project, we are aware of the outcomes we're trying to achieve. So really we should be concentrating some of this funding where there is a risk to current projects' baseline outcomes. Without drilling into that, Thomas's presentation I think gives you a bit of a signal. We've got a large amount of cost pressures. We might have some projects that are about to start or are in flight. One of the ways that we always address some of those issues is the old value engineer, which is if a cost is too high, we start pulling back the scope. Now, when you start pulling back scope of projects, you generally start impacting on the positive outcomes you're trying to achieve. And so this would be a chance to say, here's a fund that is available for us to protect ourselves from some of those cost increases against current projects we're doing or ones that are coming around the corner ready to go. So that's really important. Number 4 is really focusing on projects that stay in community ownership here. So we take the money and we invest in projects that will not be transferred back to one of the entities or the government with transfer around the entity B or the Three Waters project. So in a way, not invest in water infrastructure or Three Water infrastructure with the government's funding, which will then be transferred back to them. So we invest in local community projects and infrastructure. And again, just making sure we've aligned with the other purposes of the fund. So again, these become our basis of our core criteria to do a pass-fail on potential projects that we'll bring back to you to say, here's our list based on these criteria plus the DIA criteria. Ooh. So really hard to see there, but basically what I just described around the pass-fail criteria is in the top piece. And then there's a second set of criteria which there follows the government's guidance. So in us now taking a bunch of potential projects, putting them through an evaluation matrix of those criteria I just talked about and the government criteria, we will give you a scoring system of some proposed projects and a recommendation of what we should be applying to this project fund. So as I just said, if we take your steer today and your support of the criteria we've discussed, we'll put together the list of projects, we'll score them, and we'll bring back a recommendation to you that we apply to this fund for project X or XYZ, and then we'll proceed to then undertake that application process. Just looking across to Una as well, so the intention for us too, and it's probably not quite captured in the recommendation, is that we would be bringing back to you next month, if you've agreed these criteria, a scored matrix of these are the projects we're proposing to apply to, and then I think in the last part of the recommendation where it's signalled a report back to SPNF in August, it would just be an update at O&M that we have lodged those applications. So from today, report to next month on which projects we should be applying to this fund on, and then just an update that we have lodged that in August. So happy to answer any questions, but hopefully that does give you a view of the total picture there.
Thank you, JP. Yes, Your Worship?
Thanks, JP, and I understand the sort of high-level principle that you don't put projects in there for water investment or wastewater or sewage schemes. It's not a lot of money, and I think the decision that we make as a council is about, do we spend it as one lump in an application or try and spread it over 3 or 4? And my preference would be that we give some urgency to one project that we really feel is of heightened concern now when we heard about inflation. My issue was the timing. Don't we sort of know what we want to get behind right now? Or is it better to show that we've demonstrated meeting the criteria as part of the application?
Look, I think as we go into the end of this council term and looking to the next council term when this money would arrive, I think it's probably worthwhile just making sure we're really careful about being clear about what criteria you have applied against the government's funded criteria and that you've got a really clear view of how have you ranked the different projects for potential funding, so that I suppose as a new council arrives after October, they will also be aware of, hey, there's a funding pool of $8 million coming in for project XY or XYZ.
So what was the timing for the cut-off for the application and the timeline?
I think it was September. So.
Okay, thank you.
So there's a bit of time to give some consideration to this in terms of projects. Mr. Thomas?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, JP. Look, this looks like a really worthwhile thing to be applying for this money. As you've mentioned, it isn't committing us to taking part in the Three Waters project. I just wonder, you had your matrix up there a couple of slides ago, which were the coloured background ones, and they were around establishing the criteria. The first one, the basic eligibility, are those criteria that we have set as council, or are they criteria from central government?
There is a mix of projects, criteria there, so there is a bit of an overlap for us. So we've taken the steer about what is the purpose there, and that's the piece along the second part of the top piece is really taking the government criteria and saying, let's apply it to ourselves specifically on this. Yeah. But really for us, I think the key for us is to be really clear about finishing what we started. That's already in our planning and been through the consultation discussion. And also making sure that we've got a really clear view on the outcomes we see at risk around existing projects or projects that are about to start. So it really is more a case of being clear that as a council, our criteria is about doubling down on the stuff where we have had the previous engagement buy-in and focus before we even start applying the government's criteria to it.
Great, thank you. I think that the temptation is to look at infrastructure-heavy type things, and I noticed in the examples given by DIA there are things much more focused on community well-being, and I think this goes back to Dr. Morgan's comments and my comments in the previous discussion around the four well-being. So I think it's important that we have a wide net when we start, even if we're crossing things off very quickly because they don't meet the criteria, but I think we need to start widely and look at everything we're doing. So I hope that's part of your strategy.
And through Madam Chair, just to reassure you that I think the point of us taking this slowly and saying, here's our criteria, let's agree those, bring together an assessed set of projects, which is robust and complete, does give you the chance before we say, let's go on a single one or multiple ones, that we've had a good robust discussion about what we're applying for.
Could I just ask a very short supplementary? I just thought when I read at the beginning it said you could only put one application in. I presumed that meant for one project, but you can put one application in for multiple projects?
That's correct. It's one application period for this is our suite of projects.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that clarification.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Mr. Morgan?
Kia ora tātou, Dr. Morgan. Ka pai. So I just want to explore, the question is around stage 3 of the process, which is the assessment, and acknowledging that it's a subjective process. We've got 7, what would you call them, criteria, and they're being rated, but I see that iwi Māori consultation and community consultation, they're requirements that you've set a binary. So in terms of getting a subjective understanding, they don't contribute a lot. So if you take those 2 out, what I'm asking is then, does that mean you double count the economic wellbeing component, because you have one for each of the wellbeings plus value for money, which it's like a do wellbeing outcomes justify the cost. So what you're doing is you've got your full well-beings, and then what you're doing is you're sort of putting this economic one and saying, okay, do they represent value for money, which is, I don't think that's the way the LGA is written. So I'm just wanting to understand the reason for doing that. Thank you.
With all of these assessment criteria, there is a numerical framework and scoring approach. So, look, I think one of the things that we're going to be really conscious of when we come back to you is here is a raw score against a matrix of factors. I think what you're highlighting is that opportunity then that there is a subjective element to this, is something needing to be pulled into the higher scored position because of some other factors. And I think that gives, I think with all of these discussions is we can go through any kind of ranking and we can manipulate any kind of ranking or scoring systems, which I think is one of your highlight, not a case of creating a distortion, but any type of ranking can result in a predetermined result or something like that. But I think once we've done the scoring, there is the sore thumbing discussion here of saying, is this right? Does this represent a good outcome when we look at a more balanced approach? So scoring is only part of it. I think once you're in this room, there's a chance for you to then say, hey, maybe this score, which was 57, is actually more important than one that came in at 67. So there is a kind of a subjective conversation to that. I'm just looking across also at Gina as well, because one of the things we're just really conscious of, and it is that community support, community engagement, and in particular that Māori participation in those outcomes. Is we're actually making sure that is a really clear expectation of some of the projects we've been talking about. So as we do this evaluation, and before we bring that to you as a scored matrix, that's a really important factor that we will be exploring and confirming.
Through you again, Madam Chair. That's good, JP. I'm just wondering, and I'm not picking holes, this is actually the core of my PhD thesis. So would it be an alternative to just have the four well-beings? I ask that because it's not just about our assessment, it's also about communicating it to our stakeholders. And if there were just four well-beings, I anticipate we could communicate it better to our stakeholders, but also to our funding application itself. It's just that if we introduce the different ones, then it actually obscures any potential bias that's there, and it also makes it less transparent to the people we're trying to communicate what we want to do. So I'm not pre-selecting options or anything here, I'm just saying the process, if it's really transparent and it's mapping it directly onto the LGA, it might be stronger. I'm just interested in your thoughts. Thank you.
I suppose I'm not quite clear how that might work, but I suppose is there an option here of saying as we take a more systematic scoring approach, I don't see any problems with us also saying, look, actually we've gone back and then had a more narrative discussion about contributions across the four well-beings. So we go for that completeness of beside it, we actually make sure that there's a nice, rather than just a simple scoring matrix, which actually you lose some of the detail, we actually take a well-being descriptive approach to that as a companion to the scoring discussion, which might actually then help with the more focused conversation about did the scores come out right or not? And then I hope that would also give us a chance to say, actually now we've also got a more simple well-being matrix to start talking about the benefits that have been accrued by these applications. So I hope that's a way of melding the two things together and just helping that conversation.
No, I'm not going to labour this one any further, other than to say perhaps you could give the four well-beings a higher weighting. So that would be that. So I'm going to move on. Thank you. Councillor Maxwell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. JP, yeah, reading through this, it's a big, huge report, which is good. For me, I have every confidence in you handling this project because you've already given us examples and success in the past with the CIP one and the Acceleration Fund. The one I want to ask is the first amount, $8 million. It doesn't have to be. The project could cost even more. That number 2 would be the one that tops it up. Would that be correct? And I just have a couple of others, if that's okay.
Yes, it could. It could go into a proposed project's total funding.
And the other one is seeing where the methodology for funding allocations, 75% weighting is going to be on population, and the other one is the 20% on deprivation. Now, the fact that we in Rotorua have more than punched above our weight and had helped out with a problem in the last 2.5 years, will that all go towards helping us get any of our projects over the line?
Councillor, the key there is, and I've gone back to the original number, so the national allocation of that fund, as you say, was based on population and deprivation. Yeah. So that gave us the answer of the 32 million. As far as the criteria, we still have to meet the DIA's acceptance that we have projects that meet their criteria, plus our own. So that really is the focus of it. So it won't influence their decision about whether we have a higher deprivation. It'll be against their criteria, but the pool of funding was adjusted by the deprivation.
And final question, Madam. Final question, with a new council coming in and we're well into the project, there's no possibility that it could be cancelled or overturned or anything? I asked that question.
I think with all of the government agreements that they tend to make, so our experience with Provincial Growth Fund, SIP, and probably the IAF funding, is they do write contracts, and they do have conditions in those contracts. So if we breach those conditions, and as we saw from some of the previous ones, like the Crown Infrastructure Partnerships projects and the provincial growth, if you choose not to proceed with the project, you return the funding. So that's the risk if a council did not believe that the project that's identified in the next couple of months was appropriate and they chose not to proceed. It may be a case of they accept that they will be breaching the contract or not starting a contract.
Thank you. Councillor Tapsell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you. My question's around the fund criteria and timing on page 22 and 23, and similar, but just around the reality of a timing of a new government, because the duration of the program expenditure needs to be within that 5 years or less, and that tranche 2 as well as in 2024. So I do see in here that they will only give 10% of funding in advance, but then the remaining 90% will be released upon demonstration of expenses incurred. So I just am mindful and cautious that we could apply for this funding, but very likely there could be a new government and then it could change. So similar. So I suppose there's that question around, will contracts be able to be signed to protect the projects that we do ask to be funded? Just I have seen, even in the previous change of government, where there were community organisations that were given funding and signed contracts, but then the government still removed that funding or attempted to in many cases.
I don't believe that would occur because the contracts are binding both ways, and I would have said that extends to Provincial Growth Fund, Crown Infrastructure Partnership funding, IAF funding, as well as this funding are all multi-year contractual arrangements between government and local government for projects. So we have a number of ones that would extend beyond the next election, not just this one. And again, my assumption here is that we are only focused on the first one, which is the one that gets us to a contracted arrangement with government and whatever next government there is. And not to count our chickens with a tranche 2.
Thank you, and I do have some comments that I'll hold until later.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just ask one question perhaps before we start to think about further comments. The second tranche, which is coming in 2024, because that's some way off, will that then limit us as to what type of projects that we could be looking at, JP? Because if we're looking at, I understand, you know, the first tranche is 8 million, but that will then perhaps shrink our thinking in terms of the projects, because we know you've got to wait a couple of years. So how do we overcome that to ensure that we're taking a visionary approach to the projects that we would like to put on the table for consideration?
I think, Madam Chair, that's a very good question, because it actually opens up the opportunity for us to do some further work. If you look at the criteria about community engagement, iwi engagement and a planned project, with this first one being due in September, it does really focus us back to stuff we already know about and have planned for. So it's got this, and therefore our criteria of saying finishing what we've started is actually relevant, because actually you need to have done all those three things before you can embark on a project. With the fact that there's 2 years until that next tranche, without anticipating anything else happening, it would actually give the new council the chance to say, actually, with a focus on July 2024, is there any other new projects that we should start envisaging, and then making sure that we've undertaken that iwi engagement, the community engagement, that initial planning to say, actually, there's $24 million that could be available for a new project. So that's something for a new council to start considering, that there is time to start preparing for that tranche 2.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, I'd like to ask for a mover and a seconder, please, for 2, 3 and 4, and then we can open it up for some further discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Councillor Donaldson. So we have a mover and a seconder, so I'm going to open it up now for any further discussion on this agenda item. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Thank you.
Ai, kia ora tātou. So just the timing has been raised around the funding, but I'm also interested in the timing around the preparation. You mentioned we'd have some sort of charrette or something to work through that process, but I'm aware that Te Tātou will be in our election process, and we won't know the outcome of that election until 27th of August, and so there's a month there before we have to have submitted. But I'm just wondering, is there a way of ensuring, because at that stage I would assume that the preliminary thinking is fairly well down the track. I'm just wondering if maybe it was ensured that you had at least 4 people amongst the group that were doing that assessment who each deliberately wore the hat associated with each of those 4 wellbeings, and of course brought the expertise to be able to do that. That might sort of, I know we've got Te Tātou, but I'm just saying we might not be here at that for a fair amount of that time. Thank you.
Can I just add to that? One of the things I presume, and Madam Chair, you indulge me, and the Chief Executive might have a view on this too. Around our executive table, we wear those hats. You know, from a district development perspective, I have an economic lens. Gina has a lens from a cultural perspective that she brings. Anaru has a social perspective, and certainly from an environmental infrastructure perspective, Stavros leads that space. But that's not to isolate those perspectives, because they're not independent. A well-beings view is to evaluate all 4 well-beings together. So whilst we may have a particular corner of the well-beings framework, I think collectively as an executive we certainly bring that wider well-beings perspective to those discussions. So we do have that clear view. And so I suppose I'm struggling with the isolation of a well-beings perspective from what is our core business and a collective view. And then, as I say, coming back here, you as an elected body must have a perspective on all of those well-beings coming together as well from those different perspectives. So, so that was probably my first piece. As far as engagement and checking in on projects with Te Tato, I'll have to look across to Gina to say, actually, if the election process is really difficult and it might create some disruption as we move to that next phase, then maybe we need to do some preliminary work with Te Tato board before that occurs.
So this is our opportunity, before I put the motion, this is our opportunity as on the committee here to discuss some of what we've heard around this topic. Thank you, because we've had the opportunity to put questions before. Thank you. Any further discussion on that? Yes, thank you, Councillor Tapsell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you. And well, I want to say first off that I am pleased that we will be getting some financial assistance from the government. We are dealing with a significant amount of challenges, but I've been around long enough to know that there's never really a free lunch. So I do have great hesitation. Sorry, there's a bit of weird feedback coming. I do have great hesitation on what this will mean in terms of a support in principle, because really we haven't had that opportunity yet for us around the table to actually make a decision on whether we support or oppose the Three Waters. And I want to acknowledge the many people who have contacted us. Sorry, I'm just going to switch mics. Thank you. Oh. Yeah, that sounds a little better. I want to acknowledge the many people who have actually contacted us that their key concern is that any change to the ownership or control of these water assets must only take place with a local mandate. So I do still have an expectation that our community could have a say in the future reforms of these proposals, because if I just highlight how important our Three Waters are to Rotorua, we're actually the 10th biggest TLA in the country. And while $3 million is great, the total replacement cost of Rotorua Three Water assets are approximately $910 million. So these are significant assets for our community that our local ratepayers have paid for over generations. And I do just want to make sure that although we may proceed with this funding, there is a strong message not only to the government but also to our community that we need to have a decision and some consultation with the community about what the Three Water changes could actually mean for our community, because Rotorua Lakes Council has been doing better than others in terms of water. Our staff have done an incredible job in ensuring our drinking standards are up to scratch, dealing with the significant issues around stormwater and preparing to invest more in wastewater. So I just wanted to make those points known that we can't underestimate the disruption. We do need community consultation, and of course a crucial concern of mine is, as we've heard at this table, that these changes will bring less well-being in terms of social, community and economic well-being. So we can't take it easy. We need to make sure that we're sweating the details on this one to get it right for our community.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Tapsell. And Your Worship, thank you.
Yes, and I think we're all in that position of not seeing certainty till we see the bill put before the House, and that's when we will have to have our decision as a council on our response to the bill, and what our response will be should be informed by the wider community. I totally agree. I think in the past, as a council, we've always been there when we've got the opportunity to have access to extra funding. As Councillor Tapsell said, we're a community under some stress at the moment. I like the fact and totally trust officers to frame back to us recommendations based on the many workshops and discussions we've had in our long-term plan and in our other projects that we are considering. I don't want this to be a wish list. I can see some favourite projects coming out that we're still struggling to see how we can fund them in the long-term plan. But I think we'd all agree we want to make a substantial difference for whatever we put in that first tranche. And I just want to remind councillors that in the past, with any political cycle, I do remember turning a sod with one MP for the new hospital, but the following government fully funded the hospital for it to continue. So business as usual must continue, and you've got to have confidence as a community that we're part of opportunities that come our way. So I trust the criteria coming back. I think that's a very good process, and look forward to what comes forward for us. And in the past, we've reacted far more quickly with tourism infrastructure funding applications that just hit us, get in and tell us what you want it spent on, and substantial roading infrastructure projects that we got part of shovel ready. We didn't have this process really, but we trusted our staff to bring back the right recommendation for us to put in those funds. So I'm very confident of this process, and do want to assure the public that are writing to us all about Three Waters that the opportunity for them to have a say is when the water entity bill is tabled in the House.
Thank you. Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very much along the same lines as Her Worship's comments. I'm satisfied that it's not hush money in terms of Three Water reforms. I too can think of examples where contracts have gone through multiple changes of government. I think about the deed funding for the clean-up of the 4 priority lakes, Your Worship, put in place by a Labor government, carried on through successive governments, and we're still delivering on that deed now. So a contract's a contract, and I'm comfortable with that as well. So I think we get on and we follow the money, and look forward to seeing what the officers bring back for our approval. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, JP, for this report. I think mostly everything's been covered, from sentiment to good economic overview. My only thing is the faith that on recommendation 2C, that making an application does not bind the council to support the Three Waters reform, because I believe there are 2 different things we're talking about over here. Today is just about asking for the funding and the Three Waters reform, because the number of emails that have come through suggests that we could, anyone could sit here and that's a totally different thing altogether, and that's about the reforms. So this one here, I do support this if it comes on the floor, just to make sure that in the future we don't get in the faith that we're supporting this and that it's not part of it as indicated over here.
Thank you. Councillor Maxwell, did you have something else to say? No? Yes. Did you have something else? Yes, please.
Chair, we're speaking to the motion. Now, I support the recommendations that are up there that'll help us progress. If I recall, some time back, we've supported the Three Waters proposal in its early stages, subject to some other concerns that we had. And we also had LGNZ working on our behalf with a committee working on the concerns that many councils around the country have raised. And if I recall, recently 47 recommendations went through to the Minister of Local Government, and she supported 43 of them that got passed through there. So we do have somebody working on our behalf at the moment, and I believe even if in 18 months' time there is a change in government, the leader of the opposition at the moment has indicated, or many of his own people have indicated, they're not against making progress in this area. They do see that there is a need to do something. The status quo is not what they believe. And so, and also I've seen over the years, like my colleagues over the years have indicated, some projects that have either been continued on by whoever comes into power, like the state housing, that was one out on Waititi Hill around there. It was supported, and but now it's not a goer. We've done well over the past years in funding that have been allocated from government to us. I think something around approximately 400 million up to now, and this has been in our current mayor's watch. So who knows? I think after October, whoever is going to lead our city will work hard as well to try and get support for our city, our region that needs it. So very supportive of the motion, Madam.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I don't think there's any... I'll add a bit of discussion to this. Well, I'll add my comments, actually. We wouldn't have this fund if it wasn't for the Three Waters reform. If it wasn't for the Three Waters reform, we wouldn't have this fund. So, and that's really the reality. So we could have done with this money before, but because now it's a Three Waters reform and the government is concerned, that's why we have this fund available. So, you know, just need to take that into consideration. All around the country, people are concerned about the Three Waters reform. We see it, we hear it. It's being directed at us as well. So, you know, we talk about, and I heard her worship say, you know, we do, it is a matter of trust. I'd rather trust our staff than Wellington any day. Because our staff know that what we want to achieve here in Rotorua. We will have to wait for the bill, and then we could make some submissions, and I just hope it's not going to be a fait accompli. And that, you know, because the communities, including our own, want to actually know what will this actually mean for us. And we're getting clear signals now as to what that will mean. So that is the reality that we're working with today. So I don't think there are any further discussion. So we have had a mover. It's been moved by Mayor Chadwick, seconded by Councillor Donaldson, and I am going to put those 3 points, 2, 3 and 4, that the committee notes that A, the Rotorua district is entitled to $8.05 million in the first tranche of the Three Waters Be Better Off Fund. B, that the application must be made by September 2022. C, that making an application does not bind the council to support the Three Waters reform. 3, that the committee therefore recommends that council supports a Rotorua Lakes Council application to the first tranche of the Three Waters Be Better Off Fund. And 4, that the committee recommends that council supports the project evaluation, and prioritisation approach proposed in this report. It's been moved and seconded. I'll put that motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Sorry. Against? Thank you. Carried. Sorry. I think we'll just take a. We'll reconvene at 11:15. Thank you. We'll take a break quickly. Never mind. Who's missing? Right, thank you. Thank you. We'll resume our meeting now. So it's agenda item 6.3 on page 29 of the agenda. Recommendation, delegation of authority for the Chief Executive to approve contract 22/028, construction of Mori Street flood detention dams and wetland. May I have a mover and a seconder, please, to receive the report? Thank you, Councillor Donaldson. Thank you, Councillor Yates. I'll put that motion to receive the report. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, thank you, carried. Morena Stavros.
Morena, Madam Chair. Morena to everyone. Madam Chair, this is a simple report related to property of delegations and logistical timing recommendations. As elected members would know, some time ago we have been supported by the Crown Infrastructure Programme to the tune of about $15 million to enable stormwater management improvements in the eastern suburbs. That programme has some timeline milestones to be completed, which is going to be by June 2023. The lion's share of that work is dedicated to works above Mori Streets and adjacent to Ngatifakawi tribal land development area, where some 1,000 houses will be constructed. That land development is taking place in stages 1 to 3 at this point in time, and stages 4 and 5 will commence around October this year to allow earthworks to take place during the summer period. In terms of our stormwater mitigation works anticipated in that area, we're constructing stormwater detention dams and wetlands in the area. We expect to get the resource consents for that around early September, and also by that stage we will have the outcomes of tenders, for the construction of these earthworks. Because we want to align the earthworks of these dams, detention dams, and the earthworks in stage 4 and 5 of the land development from Ngatifakawi tribal land, and to be completed by June 2023. We are cognizant of the interruptions of the business as usual because of the elections between September and October, and we're requesting and recommending that you agree to delegate authority to the Chief Executive to consider the outcomes of those tenders, so we are able to harmonise our works together with the earthworks of the land developer, and also to meet the deadlines for June 2023 by taking advantage of the summer period for all the necessary works in the area. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Stavros? Thank you. So I am going to call for a mover and a seconder, please, for recommendation 2. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Yates. Thank you, Councillor Wang. That the committee recommends to Council to approve the delegation of authority for the Chief Executive to approve contract 22/028, construction of Mori Street flood detention dams and wetland. I'll put that motion now. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, thank you, carried. Recommendation, appointment to Tarawera Awa Restoration Group. I have a mover and a seconder to receive the report, please. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Thank you, Mr. Councillor Maxwell. That the report appointment to Tarawera Awa Restoration Group be received. I have a mover and a seconder. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, thank you. Carried. Morena Gina, thank you for overviewing the report.
Kia ora. I will mostly take it as read, but just give a very brief summary. As a part of the Ngāti Rangitahi Treaty Settlement, the Bay of Plenty Regional Council will be establishing a permanent joint committee with membership from 50% from local councils and the regional council, and 50% from iwi with interests along the Tarawera River. The catchment for the Tarawera Awa Restoration Group commences at the outlet from the lake into the river, so there is no overlap with the Te Aroha Lakes settlement provisions, which of course saw the return of the lake bed back to Te Aroha Lakes Trust. The purpose of the group is to establish a strategy which looks at all of the inputs into the health of the river and tries to identify a strategy for restoring the Mori or the well-being of that river. Notwithstanding that there are local elections due at the end of this year, there is quite a work program that Te Arawhiti and the Crown and Ngāti Rangitihi are seeking from that restoration group over the next 9 to 10 months. And accordingly, they have asked that the councils appoint a representative now. And of course, the new incoming council will either retain or reappoint at that stage. Hence the timing and the request now for an appointment. Other than that, if there are any questions, I'm happy to respond. Kia ora.
Yes, Your Worship.
Thank you, Gina. And I met last week with the negotiators, and we talked about the impact of the political cycle at this stage, and thank you for mentioning that. There may be a way of well, I have no problem with the resolution at all, but I do think we've got to say subject to endorsement of an incoming council. It's only fair. They want to get going right now, and therefore I think the nomination is absolutely appropriate at the governance level, but you're always aware at this stage it's a funny time for making appointments, so thank you for mentioning that.
Yes.
So I'd like to amend the resolution to say subject to endorsement from an incoming council. And then I feel more comfortable about that.
Yes, Una.
I might just step in there and suggest that I don't think such an amendment is required at this stage. Just to remind everybody that at the beginning of each new triennium there is a series of appointments that need to be made to other committees. This one here will be part of that suite, and therefore the new council can go through that process again of looking at appointments to the whole suite, inclusive of this one after the elections.
Thank you. So this is an appointment until basically the later in the year, really. Thank you. Yes, Councillor Maxwell.
Just briefly, no, very supportive of the motions and that are here, and it being so appropriate that you, Madam Chair, one of your many tribes, Ngāti Rangitihi, I'm sure they'd be pleased that one of their members is on the strategy group too. So, kia ora.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Morgans.
Hi, kia ora tātou. So I'm just wondering, and I think it's great that Ngāti Rangitihi want a representative from council on the group. But there's two things that come up for me. One is we're a Rotorua city, and maybe we should think about the candidate being matatau, i te reo Māori, and in our English language. And just in terms of understanding that that commitment, I'm really glad to hear that it's been talked about with Ngāti Rangitihi that they have a big work program and that they're wanting to get going. But I just wonder about that issue. The reason I say that is sometimes it's important to have a good understanding of te reo. If you're in marae meetings and things like that, some people choose not to speak in English, and it's important that we can understand in terms of all of the contributions being made. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you. Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And look, I'm really pleased to support this, and great to see it happening. And I like the comments around Te Mara o Kaituna, which I have to boast that our two council representatives on that committee come from the Lakes Community Board, Councillor Tapsell and Nick Chater. We get regular reports from them. It's great to see the work they have been doing, and I look forward to seeing the work that this new restoration group will also do for the Tarawera Awa.
Thank you. And thank you. And I'm happy to, should this go through, happy to sit on that committee until it's only until later this year. And when all, as you say, when all appointments and by the new council will be looked at. So yes, and at least the council will get somebody who actually knows something that's going on. So I'm happy to do that if it's passed this morning. So if there are no further, thank you very much. Well, I'll put that second. Oh, sorry, I need a mover and a seconder. Thank you. That the committee recommends to council that Councillor Merepeka Raukawa-Tate be appointed as the Rotorua Lakes Council representative to the Tarawera Awa Restoration Group. Thank you, Councillor Maxwell. Thank you, Councillor Yates. No further discussion. I'll put that motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary. Thank you. Carried. So we have now a resolution to go into public excluded, and we have only the one item, which is the Tarawera Sewerage Scheme update and next stages. And this is to be held in public excluded, and the reasons are so to enable good discussion around some of the commercial aspects of this proposal. So could I have a mover and a seconder, please, for the motion that the council move into public excluded? I'll move that. Thank you, and thank you, Councillor Yates.